Condemned for a crime she didn't commit, a young woman is sent aboard a brutal prison ship where disease, hunger and cruelty ensure most never see land again. Surrounded by despair, she prepares for death until a hardened sailor, moved by her will to survive, secretly offers her food, warmth, and his protection. Their fragile alliance grows into an unbreakable bond, tested by mutiny, storms, and betrayal on the high seas. In a place built for suffering, they find a spark of hope, strong enough to defy fate. The iron chains around her wrists are nothing compared to the weight of injustice that brought her here. The ship's hull groans with each wave, carrying its human cargo toward an uncertain horizon. Most prisoners die within weeks, but she refuses to surrender. But what happens when their forbidden bond threatens the very survival of everyone aboard? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The courtroom smelled of damp wool and broken dreams. Elena Blackwood stood in the dock, her hands trembling as she clutched the worn wooden rail. At 22, she had never imagined herself here, facing a judge whose cold eyes seemed to have already decided her fate before the first witness spoke. Elena Blackwood, the magistrate's voice boomed across the chamber. You stand accused of theft from the residence of Mr. Cornelius Hartwell, a crime most grievous against a gentleman of standing in our community. The forged documents lay spread across the prosecutor's table like accusations made manifest, bills of sale that bore her forged signature, testimony from witnesses she had never met, and a detailed account of how she had allegedly stolen £300 worth of silver and jewelry from the Hartwell estate where she had worked as a governess. Your Honor, Elena's voice cracked as she spoke. I swear upon my mother's grave, I never took anything from the Hartwell house. I loved those children as if they were my own. Why would I steal from the family that showed me such kindness? But her words fell on ears that had already been paid to remain deaf. Mr. Hartwell himself sat in the gallery, his face a mask of righteous indignation. Beside him, his wife dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the part of the betrayed employer to perfection. Elena's appointed counsel, a tired man who reeked of gin and defeat, barely raised his voice during the proceedings. He made no attempt to challenge the convenient timeline of events or question why a governess earning £12 a year would risk everything for items she could never hope to sell without suspicion. The truth was simpler and far more sinister. Elena had witnessed something she was never meant to see. Late one evening, while retrieving a book from Mr. Hartwell's study, she had discovered him in passionate embrace with his business partner's wife. The shame in his eyes when he spotted her told her everything she needed to know about her precarious position. Within a week, items began disappearing from the house. Within a month, Elena found herself accused of the thefts. The forged evidence was masterfully crafted, her signature practiced until it was nearly perfect. Witnesses emerged from shadows, ready to swear they had seen her acting suspiciously, meeting with known fences, displaying wealth beyond her station. The evidence against you is overwhelming, the magistrate declared, his powdered wig slightly askew as he leaned forward. You have betrayed the trust placed in you by a Christian family, violated the sacred bond between servant and master, and brought shame upon the very institution of domestic service. Elena's sister Sarah sat weeping in the gallery, her husband's strong arm around her shoulders. They had no money for proper legal representation, no connections to challenge the word of a wealthy merchant against that of a lowly governess. In the eyes of the law, Elena's guilt was predetermined by her station in life. Furthermore, the magistrate continued, your crime represents a threat to the natural order of our society. If servants cannot be trusted in the homes of their betters, if the bonds of loyalty and gratitude can be so easily severed by greed, then the very foundations of our civilization are at risk. The sentence, when it came, fell like a hammer blow. Transportation to the Australian colonies aboard one of His Majesty's prison ships. 7 years of hard labor if she survived the voyage. Most didn't. Elena's knees buckled as the words washed over her. 7 years. By the time she returned, if she returned, Sarah's children would be grown. Her parents would likely be dead. and the life she had known would be nothing but memory. That final night in Newgate prison, Elena sat on the straw-covered floor of her cell and wrote a letter she knew might never be delivered. Her fingers, stained with cheap ink, formed words of love and farewell to the sister who had raised her after their parents died. "Dearest Sarah," she wrote, "if you receive this letter, know that I go to my fate with a clear conscience. I am guilty of nothing save witnessing the sins of those more powerful than myself. Watch over your children, and if God wills it, perhaps we shall meet again in a better world." The morning brought iron shackles and a wagon ride to Portsmouth Harbour, where the prison ship Redemption waited like a floating tomb. Elena clutched her letter close to her heart, the only thing she owned that represented the life she was leaving behind. As the wagon wheels clattered over cobblestones toward her uncertain fate, Elena made a silent promise to herself. She would survive this ordeal, not for revenge, but for the hope that somewhere in the darkness ahead, justice might still find a way to prevail. The first sight of the Redemption rising from Portsmouth Harbour's murky waters struck Elena like a physical blow. The massive three-masted vessel loomed against the grey morning sky, its black hull scarred by countless voyages and weathered by salt spray and human suffering. Converted from a merchant ship, it now served the Crown's darker purpose of transporting the unwanted to the far reaches of the Empire. Captain Morrison stood at the gangplank, a barrel-chested man whose face bore the permanent sneer of someone who had long ago abandoned any pretense of human compassion. His uniform was immaculate, a stark contrast to the filthy rags worn by the prisoners being herded aboard like cattle. "Welcome to your new home," he announced with mock ceremony, as Elena's group was pushed forward. "For the next 4 months, you belong to me. Obey, and you might see Australia. Resist, and you'll feed the fish." The ship's bell clanged mournfully as Elena was forced down a narrow ladder into the cargo hold. The stench hit her immediately: unwashed bodies, human waste, rotting food, and the overwhelming smell of fear and despair. The space had been divided into cramped compartments, each barely large enough for a dozen people to lie down. Weak sunlight filtered through a few barred portholes, casting strange shadows across faces that had already lost hope. Women and men were separated by heavy iron grating, though the distinction provided little comfort in such conditions. Children huddled close to their mothers, their eyes wide with terror they were too young to understand. "First time on a prison ship?" asked a weathered woman, whose missing teeth gave her words a whistling quality. "I'm Mary Henning, been transported twice, escaped from Van Diemen's Land and got caught again." Elena nodded, still overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. The iron shackles around her ankles had already begun to chafe, and the wooden floor beneath her feet was slick with moisture she preferred not to identify. "Listen carefully, girl," Mary continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There are rules down here that ain't written in any book. Keep your head down, don't trust the guards, and never ever let them see you cry. Tears are a luxury that'll get you killed." Around them, other prisoners shared their stories in hushed tones. A pickpocket from London's East End, a political prisoner whose only crime was speaking against the king's policies, a debtor whose family had abandoned him to creditors. Each tale added another layer to the suffocating atmosphere of injustice. The ship lurched suddenly as anchors were raised, and several prisoners lost their footing. Elena braced herself against the rough wooden wall, feeling the vessel begin its ponderous turn toward open water. Through the porthole nearest her, she caught a final glimpse of England's shore, green hills and church spires growing smaller with each passing moment. "The first week's the worst," Mary explained, as the ship began to roll with ocean swells. "Half of us will be sick as dogs, and the guards won't clean up the mess. Just try to keep some food down and don't tink the water unless you're desperate." As if summoned by her words, a guard appeared at the iron gate separating their compartment from the corridor. He was young, perhaps in his 20s, with the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent most of his time below deck. His eyes swept across the prisoners with professional disinterest before settling briefly on Elena. "Daily rations," he announced, sliding a wooden bucket through a slot in the gate. The contents looked like gruel mixed with sawdust, accompanied by chunks of bread, so hard they could have served as weapons. Elena watched the other prisoners divide the meager portions with practiced efficiency. There was no fighting, no desperate scrambling. They had learned that cooperation was the only path to survival. She accepted her share with gratitude, though the food tasted like despair made manifest. As night fell and the ship settled into its rhythm of creaks and groans, Elena lay on the hard floor and listened to the sounds around her. Whispered prayers, stifled sobs, and the occasional moan from someone too sick to maintain dignity. The darkness was absolute except for the faint glow of a single lantern hanging in the corridor. "Tomorrow they'll put us to work," Mary whispered from beside her. "Mending sails, scrubbing decks, whatever keeps us too tired to cause trouble. The ones who can't work." She didn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. Elena pulled her thin blanket closer and closed her eyes, though sleep seemed impossible. Somewhere above, she could hear the crew moving about their duties, living in a different world from the hell below deck. The ship's bell marked the hours, each clang a reminder that she was moving further from everything she had ever known. In the distance, barely audible above the ocean's endless song, she thought she heard footsteps on the deck above, measured, purposeful, somehow different from the others. She didn't know that those steps belonged to James William Cooper, the ship's navigator, who stood at the rail wondering about the cargo of human souls traveling beneath his feet. The first week aboard the Redemption tested every fiber of Elena's being. The watered gruel served twice daily barely sustained life, and the stale water tasted of rust and desperation. Around her, prisoners succumbed to seasickness, dysentery, and the crushing weight of hopelessness. Each morning brought the grim task of identifying who had died during the night. Elamora that forced herself to move when others lay still, to eat when nausea threatened to overwhelm her, and to help when every instinct screamed for self-preservation. She had witnessed too much injustice to surrender now to mere discomfort. Above deck, James William Cooper charted their course with mathematical precision, while his thoughts wandered to the human cargo below. At 28, he had served His Majesty's Navy for 6 years before choosing the merchant marine for its promise of adventure without the rigid brutality of military life. Yet this voyage challenged everything he believed about duty and honor. The ship's routine was unforgiving. Prisoners were brought up in small groups to scrub decks, mend sails, and perform the back-breaking labor that kept the vessel functional. Those too weak to work remained below, often never to emerge again. Elena's first day on deck came during her second week aboard. The sunlight, even filtered through grey clouds, nearly blinded her after so many days in darkness. She breathed deeply of the salt air, feeling almost human again despite the iron shackles that marked her status. "You there," called Bosun Drake, a thick-set man whose scarred hands spoke of violence both given and received. "Get those ropes coiled proper, or you'll taste the cat." Elena had never handled ship's rigging, but she watched the other prisoners and learned quickly. The work was demanding, but it offered escape from the suffocating hold and a chance to feel useful rather than merely cargo. From his position near the navigation station, James observed the new prisoners with professional interest. Most moved with the shuffle of the defeated, but one young woman worked with determined efficiency despite her obvious inexperience. Her dark hair, though matted and unwashed, caught the light when she turned her head, and there was something in her posture that suggested unbroken spirit. During the midday meal break, Elena found herself assigned to distribute water to the working prisoners. It was a position of minor responsibility, but it allowed her to assess the condition of her fellow captives. Some were clearly dying, their eyes already holding the distant look of those who had abandoned hope. Others, like herself, still fought for each day of survival. A small commotion near the ship's rail caught her attention. A child, perhaps 8 years old, had collapsed while carrying a bucket of tar. The boy's mother knelt beside him, her face etched with despair as she tried to rouse him from unconsciousness. Without thinking, Elena abandoned her water duty and hurried to help. The child was burning with fever, his small body racked by chills despite the warmth of the day. She tore a strip from her already ragged skirt and dipped it in the water bucket, using it to cool his forehead. "Please," the mother whispered, "he's all I have left." Elena looked around desperately, knowing that medical supplies were reserved for crew members. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Whitmore, was notorious for being drunk more often than sober, and prisoners received medical attention only when their death might impact the ship's operation. "Keep him cool," Elena instructed the mother, though she knew it was inadequate advice, and try to get fluids into him whenever he's conscious. As she worked to comfort the child, Elena became aware of someone watching her. She looked up to see a man in officer's clothing standing near the mainmast, his eyes fixed on her actions, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Unlike the other crew members, his face showed neither cruelty nor indifference, but something that might have been concern. James had intended to walk past the scene, maintaining the professional distance that separated officers from prisoners. But something about the young woman's gentle ministrations to the sick child struck him unexpectedly. In her careful attention to someone else's suffering, he saw an echo of the compassion that had once motivated his own choices. That evening, as prisoners were returned to the hold, Elena settled into her usual spot near Mary Henning. The older woman had been watching Elena's behavior with increasing interest. "You made quite an impression today," Mary observed quietly, "both above and below deck." "I don't know what you mean," Elena replied, though she had noticed the way some of the other prisoners looked at her now with something approaching respect rather than mere acceptance. "That boy you helped," Mary continued, "his fever broke this afternoon. Someone left a small packet of willow bark powder near his mother's sleeping area. Strange thing to find on a prison ship." Elena's heart quickened, though she kept her expression neutral. "Perhaps the ship's stores include medical supplies for emergency." Mary's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. Perhaps someone up top took notice of a prisoner who still remembers how to be human. As darkness settled over the ship, Elena lay awake, listening to the sounds of suffering around her. But mixed with the usual chorus of despair, she heard something new. The child's steady breathing, indicating that his fever had indeed broken. Somewhere in the darkness she found a small crust of bread that hadn't been there before, fresher and softer than the usual ration. She ate it slowly, savoring not just the nourishment, but the possibility it represented. In this floating hell, someone had noticed her small act of kindness and responded in kind. It was the first spark of hope she had felt since leaving English shores. The storm struck without warning on Elena's third week aboard the Redemption. What had begun as a gentle morning breeze quickly escalated into a howling gale that sent mountainous waves crashing over the ship's bow. The vessel pitched and rolled like a toy in a bathtub, and the sounds from below deck turned from misery to terror. Elena clung to a support beam as cargo shifted dangerously around the hold. Heavy barrels of water and salt pork, inadequately secured, slid back and forth with each roll of the ship. The prisoners pressed themselves against the walls, trying to avoid being crushed by the moving freight. "Hold fast," Mary Henning shouted over the wind's roar. "These old ships have weathered worse than this." But even as she spoke, a massive barrel broke free from its restraints and careened across the hold. Elena saw it coming toward a group of children huddled near the far wall, and threw herself forward without thinking. The barrel struck her shoulder with crushing force, sending her sprawling across the wet deck. Pain shot through her arm and ribs as she struggled to breathe. Around her, other prisoners called out warnings as more cargo broke loose. The ship's timbers groaned ominously, and water began seeping through stressed joints in the hull. Above deck, James fought to maintain the ship's heading, while Captain Morrison shouted orders through the howling wind. The storm had caught them in open ocean, far from any shelter, and survival depended on keeping the vessel pointed into the waves, rather than allowing it to turn broadside. "Secure that rigging," Morrison bellowed as a sail tore loose from its moorings. "If we lose canvas, we're dead in the water." James had navigated through dozens of storms, but this one tested even his experienced skills. The compass spun wildly as the ship pitched, and traditional navigation became nearly impossible. Yet his thoughts kept drifting to the human cargo below, wondering how many would survive the night. When the storm finally began to subside near dawn, the extent of the damage became clear. Several prisoners had been seriously injured, including Elena, who lay semi-conscious against the hull with her left arm hanging at an unnatural angle. James descended to the hold with Dr. Whitmore, ostensibly to assess casualties that might affect the ship's operation. The surgeon, for once relatively sober due to the crisis, moved efficiently among the injured, while James tried to appear professionally detached. "This one's got a dislocated shoulder," Whitmore announced, kneeling beside Elena. "Needs to be reset immediately, or she'll lose use of the arm." Elena's eyes fluttered open as the doctor examined her injury. Through her pain, she recognized the officer who had been watching her work on deck. Up close, she could see intelligence in his grey eyes, along with something that looked remarkably like concern. "Hold her steady," Whitmore instructed James. "This is going to hurt." James positioned himself behind Elena, his hands gentle but firm on her good shoulder. She could smell soap and clean linen, luxuries that seemed impossible in her current world. "Bite down on this," James said quietly, offering her a piece of leather, "and try to relax your muscles." The pain when Whitmore reset her shoulder was excruciating, but Elena bit down hard and refused to cry out. She felt James's steady presence behind her, his hands offering silent support through the worst of it. "There," the doctor announced with satisfaction. "Good as new, assuming it heals properly." As Whitmore moved on to other patients, James lingered beside Elena. Their eyes met for a moment, and she saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken despite her pain. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. "You were brave," he replied, his voice low enough that others couldn't hear. "Throwing yourself at that barrel to protect those children. That took courage." Elena struggled to sit up straighter, aware that this conversation was dangerous for both of them. Officers didn't speak privately with prisoners, especially not with the kind of gentleness she heard in his voice. "I'm James," he said simply. "James William Cooper. I navigate this ship." "Elena," she replied, then added with bitter humor, "I navigate nothing except survival." A slight smile crossed his features. "Survival is its own form of navigation. You plot a course through dangerous waters, using whatever instruments you have available." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small compass, its brass surface worn smooth by years of use. "This belonged to my brother. He died serving His Majesty's Navy, and I've carried it ever since as a reminder that some things are worth the risk." Elena stared at the compass, confused by the gesture. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," James said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard, "I've been watching you these past weeks. You haven't let this place break your spirit, and you risk yourself to help others. That's rare, whether above deck or below." Before Elena could respond, Bosun Drake's voice boomed from the ladder. "Cooper, Captain wants damage reports now." James rose quickly, his professional demeanor sliding back into place. But as he turned to leave, he spoke quietly without looking back. "Your shoulder will need attention. Keep it clean and try not to use that arm for heavy work." Elena watched him climb the ladder, her mind reeling from the unexpected encounter. In a world where kindness was a luxury and compassion a liability, she had just experienced both from the most unlikely source. The compass remained in her hand, solid and warm, a tangible reminder that not everyone aboard the Redemption had abandoned their humanity. Mary Henning settled beside her with a knowing look. "Careful, girl. Officers and prisoners don't mix well on ships like this." "I know," Elena replied, closing her fingers around the compass. "But sometimes the most dangerous courses lead to the only safe harbors." In the weeks following the storm, a careful dance began between Elena and James. He found reasons to inspect the prisoners' work areas when she was on deck, always maintaining professional distance while slipping her small comforts: a piece of soap wrapped in cloth, clean water in a hidden bottle, strips of linen that could serve as bandages for her healing shoulder. Elena proved herself invaluable among the prisoners. Her education as a governess meant she could read and write, skills that made her useful for inventory tasks that other inmates couldn't manage. More importantly, her gentle nature and quick mind made her a natural leader among the women. When young Timothy Morrison, no relation to the captain, developed a fever similar to the child Elena had helped weeks earlier, she knew exactly what to do. The willow bark powder had appeared again near her sleeping area, along with a small vial of honey to make the bitter medicine palatable. "Where did you get this?" asked Rebecca Turner, Timothy's mother, as Elena prepared the remedy. "Does it matter?" Elena replied, crushing the bark into powder. "Your son needs medicine, and someone has provided this." The treatment worked, and word spread through the hold that Elena possessed healing knowledge. Soon prisoners came to her with various ailments, infected cuts, persistent coughs, digestive troubles. She had no formal medical training, but her gentle touch and the mysterious supplies that periodically appeared allowed her to provide comfort where none had existed before. Dr. Whitmore, during one of his rare sober visits to the hold, noticed the improvement in the prisoners' overall health. "Someone's been tending to these people properly," he observed to James as they climbed back to the upper deck. "Whoever it is knows something about medicine. Perhaps they're simply taking better care of each other," James suggested carefully. Whitmore gave him a sharp look. "Or perhaps someone with access to the ship's medical supplies has taken an interest in their welfare." The conversation made James realize how precarious his position had become. His small acts of kindness were being noticed, and discovery would mean court-martial and disgrace. Yet each time he saw Elena's gentle care for others, his resolve to help her only strengthened. Their first real conversation came during a calm evening when Elena was assigned to inventory rope supplies on deck. James approached under the pretense of checking her work, but lingered when other crew members moved out of earshot. "Your shoulder seems to be healing well," he observed, watching her carefully coil a length of line. "Thanks to proper treatment," she replied, meeting his eyes briefly. "I'm grateful for the care I received." James understood her coded message. "Tell me about your life before this," he said, settling onto a nearby crate, as if merely taking a rest. Elena's hands stilled on the rope. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her as a person, rather than a prisoner. "I was a governess," she said finally. "I taught children to read and write, helped them understand the world beyond their nursery walls." "Did you enjoy the work?" "Very much. There's something magical about watching a child's face when they finally understand a difficult concept, or when they read their first complete story." Her voice carried a warmth that had been absent during their previous encounters. James found himself genuinely curious about her experiences. "What subjects did you teach?" "Reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, a little French. The children loved stories best, adventure tales about far-off places and brave heroes." She paused, then added with bitter irony, "I never imagined I'd have my own adventure, though it's nothing like the stories I used to tell." "What brought you here?" James asked gently. "If you don't mind me asking." Elena's expression hardened. "I was convenient," she said simply. "A man of wealth and position needed someone to blame for his own crimes, and a governess with no family connections made a perfect target." The pain in her voice was evident, and James felt anger rise in his chest. He had served long enough to know that justice was often a luxury, available only to those who could afford it. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "Are you?" Elena asked, studying his face. "Or are you simply being polite to pass the time?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. "I've been at sea for 10 years, he said after a moment. "I've seen enough injustice to know it when I encounter it. What happened to you was wrong." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of other crew members, forcing them back into the roles of officer and prisoner. But something had shifted between them, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended their circumstances. That night, Elena found a small packet beside her sleeping area, containing not just medical supplies but paper and a pencil. The implications were clear. James trusted her enough to provide materials that could be used to document conditions aboard the ship or plan escape attempts. Instead, Elena used them to write, not complaints or accusations, but stories, the kind of adventure tales she had once shared with her pupils. She wrote about brave sailors and kind-hearted officers, about prisoners who maintained their dignity despite impossible circumstances, about the possibility that even in the darkest places, human goodness could survive and flourish. When she discreetly showed the stories to Mary Henning, the older woman smiled for the first time since Elena had known her. "These are beautiful, child, but be careful. Hope is a dangerous thing on a ship like this." "Perhaps," Elena replied, watching the stars through the porthole. "But despair is more dangerous still." 2 months into the voyage, Elena found herself looking forward to her deck assignments with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified her. James had found increasingly creative ways to spend time near her work areas, and their conversations had evolved from cautious exchanges to something approaching genuine friendship. During a particularly calm evening, as Elena mended a torn sail under the setting sun, James approached with his navigation charts under his arm. To any observer, he was simply checking on prisoner work details. In reality, he had been waiting all day for this moment alone with her. "The stars are particularly clear tonight," he observed, settling onto a nearby crate, perfect for celestial navigation. Elena looked up from her needlework to see him spreading a chart across his lap. "I've always wondered how sailors find their way across such vast distances. It seems like magic. Mathematics." "Actually," James replied with a slight smile, "though I suppose there's magic in the way numbers can guide you home across thousands of miles of empty ocean." He moved closer, ostensibly to show her the chart, but Elena was acutely aware of his proximity. She could smell the soap he used, see the careful attention he paid to his appearance, despite the harsh conditions aboard ship. "This is our current position," he said, pointing to a spot on the chart. "We're making good time towards Sydney Harbour, barring any more storms." Elena studied the map, her finger tracing the vast distance they had already travelled. "It's hard to believe we're so far from England," she murmured. "Sometimes it feels like a dream or a nightmare I can't wake from." "And which is it?" James asked quietly. "Dream or nightmare?" Elena met his eyes, seeing something in them that made her pulse quicken. "That depends," she said carefully, "on what waits at the end of the journey." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Elena found herself studying the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar, the gentle strength in his hands as he rolled up the chart. "Elena," James began, then stopped himself, glancing around to ensure they weren't observed. "I need to tell you something about why I'm on this voyage." He had never spoken so personally before, and Elena sensed the importance of whatever he was about to reveal. "I had a brother," James continued, his voice taking on a distant quality. "Thomas, who was 2 years younger, and twice as brave as any man had a right to be. He died at Trafalgar, serving under Nelson." Elena waited, understanding that this confession came at great cost. "After his death, I couldn't bear to stay in the Navy. Too many memories, too many reminders of what I'd lost. So I took work on merchant ships, thinking that distance and different waters might help me forget." He paused, looking out at the darkening sea. "But you can't sail away from grief. It follows you like a shadow. Is that why you're kind to me?" Elena asked gently. "Because you understand loss." James turned back to her, his expression serious. "No," he said firmly. "I'm kind to you because you remind me that compassion isn't dead, even in places like this. You tend to the sick, comfort the frightened, and maintain your dignity when others would have surrendered to despair. You make me want to be better than I am." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. No man had ever spoken to her with such honest admiration, and the intensity of his gaze made her heart race. "James," she whispered, acutely aware of the dangerous territory they were entering. "I know this is impossible," he said quickly. "I know the risks for both of us. But I needed you to know that what I feel for you has nothing to do with pity or guilt." It's something much more dangerous than that." Before Elena could respond, the sound of boots on the deck made them spring apart. Bosun Drake emerged from the shadows, his suspicious gaze moving between them. "Cooper," Drake said slowly, "Captain wants to see the navigation reports. Now." "Of course," James replied, his professional demeanor sliding seamlessly into place. "I was just ensuring the prisoner completed her sail repairs properly." Drake's eyes lingered on Elena, who had resumed her needlework with forced concentration. "Mighty careful attention you pay to prisoner work, Mr. Cooper. Might give a man the wrong impression." "My attention to detail is what keeps this ship on course, Drake," James replied coolly. "I suggest you focus on your own duties." The tension between the two men was palpable. Drake's reputation for cruelty was well known among prisoners and crew alike, and Elena sensed that James had just made a dangerous enemy. After both men left, Elena sat alone on the deck, her hands trembling as she attempted to continue her work. The letter she had begun writing weeks ago lay hidden in her clothes, a confession of feelings she had been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. That night, in the suffocating darkness of the hold, Elena lay awake thinking about James's words. The possibility of love aboard a prison ship seemed as impossible as navigation without stars, yet she could no longer deny what she felt for him. In her hidden letter, she finally wrote the words that had been growing in her heart: "I believe I am falling in love with a man whose kindness may be the death of us both." The reckoning came on a grey morning when the sea lay flat as hammered steel, and the ship moved through the water with barely a whisper of wind in its sails. Captain Morrison stood on the quarterdeck, his face bearing the cold satisfaction of a man about to exercise absolute power. "Miss Cooper," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the deck. "Present yourself." James approached with measured steps, his expression carefully neutral despite the sick feeling growing in his stomach. He had known this moment would come eventually, had seen it in Drake's knowing looks and the captain's increasingly suspicious glances. "It has come to my attention," Morrison began, pacing slowly around James like a predator circling wounded prey, "that you have been overly familiar with the prisoners under our care." The accusation hung in the salt air like a challenge. James kept his voice steady as he replied, "I perform my duties as assigned, Captain. Nothing more." "Nothing more? Nothing more?" Morrison's voice rose sharply. "Then perhaps you can explain how medical supplies have been disappearing from our stores, how certain prisoners seem remarkably well fed compared to their rations, how you spend considerable time in areas where prisoners work." From her position scrubbing the deck nearby, Elena felt ice form in her veins. She forced herself to continue working, knowing that any reaction might make things worse for James. Bosun Drake stepped forward, a coil of rope in his hands, the cat-o'-nine tails that served as the ship's instrument of discipline. "Found these in his quarters, Captain," he announced, producing a small collection of items: medical bandages, a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, and a bottle of fresh water. James's jaw tightened, but he offered no excuse or explanation. Elena watched in horror as the evidence of his kindness was displayed like criminal contraband. "The penalty for theft of ship's stores is well established," Morrison declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the deck. "As is the punishment for fraternizing with prisoners." He paused, letting the implications sink in. 20 lashes. Elena's hands stilled on her scrub brush. 20 lashes could kill a man or leave him permanently damaged. She wanted to cry out, to confess her part in everything, but Mary Henning's warning hand on her arm held her back. "Strip him and secure him to the mainmast," Morrison ordered. 2 crew members moved to comply, but James held up his hand. "I'll not resist," he said quietly, beginning to remove his shirt himself. "But I want it known that I regret nothing I've done aboard this ship." Elena bit her lip so hard she tasted blood as James was bound to the mast, his back exposed to the instrument of punishment. His skin was pale in the morning light, unmarked by previous discipline. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he braced himself for what was to come. Drake raised the cat, its leather strands spreading like deadly fingers. The first blow landed with a crack that seemed to echo off the water itself. James's body jerked against the restraints, but he made no sound. By the 5th lash, blood began to flow down his back. By the 10th, Elena was fighting not to be sick. By the 15th, even some of the crew members looked uncomfortable with the brutality they were witnessing. Throughout it all, James maintained his silence, refusing to give Morrison the satisfaction of hearing him cry out. When the 20th blow finally fell, he hung limply against the rope, his back a maze of cuts and welts. "Cut him down," Morrison ordered. "Mr. Cooper, you will continue your duties as navigator, but you are confined to quarters when not on watch. Any further infractions will result in court-martial and hanging." As James was untied and helped to his feet, his eyes found Elena's across the deck. In that brief moment, she saw not defeat, but determination, a promise that this punishment had not broken his spirit or changed his feelings. Whitmore, looking more sober than he had in weeks, helped James toward the ship's infirmary. As they passed Elena's work area, Whitmore spoke quietly but clearly enough for her to hear. "Clean bandages and willow bark tea. He'll need both if infection is to be avoided." The message was clear. Whitmore was willing to help treat James's wounds, but someone would need to provide the supplies and care. That evening, when the ship had settled into its night routine, Elena made her way carefully through the shadows toward the officers' quarters. She carried strips of cloth torn from her own undergarments and a precious vial of willow bark powder she had saved from her own supplies. She found James lying face down on his narrow bunk, his back still seeping blood through makeshift bandages. Whitmore looked up from his position beside the bed. "Ah," the doctor said with grim satisfaction. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Elena knelt beside the bunk, her heart breaking at the sight of James's injuries. "This is my fault," she whispered. "No," James said, his voice muffled by the pillow, but still strong. "This is the price of choosing compassion over duty. I'd pay it again." As Elena gently cleaned his wounds and applied fresh bandages, she realized that their relationship had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The punishment had been intended to break them apart, but instead it had forged their bond in something stronger than mere affection. "We have to be more careful," she whispered as she worked. "Yes," James agreed, then added with a slight smile despite his pain, "but we don't have to stop caring." The flogging of James Cooper sent ripples of discontent throughout the ship that grew stronger with each passing day. In the officers' quarters, crew members spoke in hushed tones about Morrison's increasing cruelty. In the hold, prisoners whispered about the navigator, who had risked everything to show them kindness. Seaman Harris, a weathered man with 20 years at sea, approached James during his first night watch after the punishment. The navigator stood at the helm, his movements careful to avoid aggravating the still healing wounds on his back. "That was a hard business yesterday," Harris said quietly, checking the horizon before continuing. "Harder than necessary, if you ask me." James kept his eyes on the compass, aware that this conversation could be dangerous for both of them. "The captain maintains discipline as he sees fit." "Does he now?" Harris moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Tell me, Cooper, how many good men have you seen broken by commanders who forgot the difference between discipline and cruelty?" The question hung in the salt air between them. James had indeed seen too many officers who wielded power like a weapon, crushing the spirits of those under their command, rather than inspiring loyalty. "What are you suggesting, Harris?" James asked carefully. "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time someone reminded Captain Morrison that a ship runs on the consent of its crew, not just the fear of punishment." Before James could respond, Harris melted back into the shadows, leaving behind only the implication of his words. But James understood perfectly. Mutiny was being discussed among the crew, and his punishment had provided the spark needed to ignite long-simmering resentments. In the hold below, a different conversation was taking place among the prisoners. Elena sat in the center of a circle of women, her voice low but firm as she addressed their desperate situation. We can't continue to lose people at this rate, she said, gesturing toward the corner where 2 more bodies lay wrapped in sailcloth, awaiting burial at sea. 17 have died since we left Portsmouth, and we're barely halfway to Australia. Mary Henning nodded grimly. The rations keep getting smaller while the work gets harder. Morrison's trying to kill us slowly so he doesn't have to account for mass death. Then we need to take action, declared Rebecca Turner, the mother whose son Elena had helped heal. We outnumber the crew 3 to 1. If we coordinate properly, revolution is dangerous, Elena warned, though she could see the appeal in Rebecca's word. If we fail, the consequences will be deadly for everyone involved. The consequences of doing nothing are already deadly, countered another prisoner, a political radical named William Frost, who had been transported for seditious writing. At least resistance offers the possibility of change. Elena found herself in an impossible position. Her natural instincts favored peaceful solutions, but the daily reality of their situation made clear that peaceful resistance was ineffective against Morrison's tyranny. The discovery of the hidden weapons cache came 3 days later, when a prisoner cleaning the forward storage area noticed loose boards in the flooring. Beneath lay a collection of cutlasses, pistols and ammunition, remnants from the ship's previous incarnation as a military vessel. Word of the weapons spread through the hold like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations and meaningful glances. Elena found herself appointed as one of the leaders of the prisoner uprising, her education and natural authority making her a logical choice despite her personal reservation. Meanwhile, above deck, Harris continued his careful recruitment among the crew. The ship's cook, tired of seeing his food stores depleted by Morrison's corruption, the bosun's mate, whose brother had been flogged to death on Morrison's previous command. Even some of the Marines assigned to guard the prisoners began to question orders that seemed designed more to inflict suffering than maintain order. James found himself caught between worlds, respected by the crew for his competence and integrity, yet monitored constantly by Morrison and Drake for signs of further insubordination. When Harris finally approached him directly about joining the mutiny, James faced the most difficult decision of his life. "I'm not asking you to betray your oath," Harris explained during a quiet moment in the chart room. "I'm asking you to remember what that oath really meant, to serve king and country, not to taintle the murder of innocents." James studied the navigation charts spread before him, plotting their course toward Australia, while simultaneously contemplating a course that could lead to court-martial and execution. "What exactly are you proposing?" "We take the ship during the next storm," Harris said simply. "Weather provides cover for the noise, and Morrison will be distracted by navigation concerns. The prisoners rise simultaneously from below, while we secure the upper deck. And then what? We're still thousands of miles from the nearest friendly port." Harris smiled grimly. "That's where we need you, Cooper. You're the only one aboard who can navigate us safely to Australia, under new leadership, of course." The irony wasn't lost on James. His specialized skills made him indispensable to both the current regime and any potential rebellion. The question was which path better served the principles he claimed to value. That night, as Elena tended his still healing wounds in the shadows of the ship's rigging, James shared the burden of his decision. "They want me to join them," he said quietly. "Lead them, actually." Elena's hands stilled on his back. "And what do you want?" "I want to see you free," he replied without hesitation. "I want to see all of you free from this floating hell. But I also know that mutiny is treason, and failure means death for everyone involved." Elena resumed her gentle ministrations, considering his words carefully. "Sometimes," she said finally, "the greatest treason is remaining loyal to those who have abandoned honor entirely." The signal came in the form of a yellow flag hung from the rigging during the morning watch. A piece of torn sail that to casual observers appeared to be drying in the sun. But to those who knew its meaning, it announced that the mutiny would begin at sunset, when the changing of the watch provided maximum confusion and opportunity. Elena spent the day in careful preparation, moving through the hold with quiet efficiency as she organized the prisoners into groups. Each person had been assigned a specific role. The strongest would secure the weapons cache and overwhelm the guards, while others would block passages to prevent loyalist crew members from reaching the upper deck. "Remember," she whispered to Rebecca Turner as they pretended to sort through damaged clothing. "We wait for the ship's bell to ring 6 times, then count to 100 before we move. Timing is everything." Rebecca nodded, her face pale but determined. "What about the children? They can't be part of the fighting." "Mary Henning will keep them in the aft section," Elena replied. "Once we control the hold, they'll be safe." The plan seemed simple enough, but Elena knew that reality would be far more chaotic than their careful preparations suggested. Too many variables, too many opportunities for things to go wrong. Yet the alternative, continuing to accept their gradual extermination under Morrison's cruelty, was no longer tolerable. Above deck, James performed his navigation duties with mechanical precision, while his mind raced through the implications of the coming rebellion. Harris had provided him with a detailed map showing which crew members could be trusted, and which would likely fight to maintain the current order. Dr. Whitmore, surprisingly, had agreed to help treat wounded from both sides. "I took an oath to preserve life," he had explained during a private conversation. "That oath doesn't distinguish between officers and prisoners, rebels and loyalists." The ship's bell marking the hours seemed to toll with unusual weight throughout the day. Each chime brought them closer to a moment that would either bring freedom or death to everyone involved. During the afternoon watch, James found himself standing next to Captain Morrison at the ship's rail, both men ostensibly checking the rigging, but actually engaged in their own form of psychological warfare. "The men seem restless today," Morrison observed, his cold eyes scanning the crew members going about their duties. "Perhaps the tropical heat is affecting their temperament." "Perhaps," James replied carefully, aware that this conversation was a test of some kind. Morrison turned to face him directly. "You know, Cooper, I've been thinking about your recent difficulties. A man of your skills and background could go far in His Majesty's service if he demonstrated proper loyalty and judgment." The offer was clear: redemption in exchange for information about the brewing mutiny. James felt the weight of Morrison's expectations, knowing that his response would determine not just his own fate, but that of everyone counting on him. "I serve the Crown to the best of my ability, Captain," James said simply. "Always have, always will." Morrison's smile was thin and cold. "I'm glad to hear it, because tonight I suspect that loyalty may be tested in ways you haven't anticipated." The word sent a chill down James's spine. Did Morrison know about the planned uprising, or was he simply being cautious? Either way, the captain's warning suggested that the mutineers might be walking into a trap. As evening approached, Elena made her final rounds through the hold, checking on the readiness of each group while trying to project calm confidence she didn't entirely feel. The hidden weapons had been distributed among the most reliable prisoners, though the rusty cutlasses and ancient pistols were hardly inspiring weapons. "Are you ready for this?" Mary Henning asked, as Elena paused beside her sleeping area. Elena fingered the small signal flag, hidden in her clothing, a piece of red cloth that would coordinate the prisoners' uprising with the crew mutiny above. "I'm ready to stop being a victim," she replied. "Whether that makes me ready for revolution, I suppose we'll discover." The ship's bell began to toll 6 o'clock as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that seemed prophetic of the blood that might soon be spilled. Elena felt her heart hammering as she began the silent count that would end with either freedom or death. Above deck, James stood at his navigation station and watched Harris move casually toward the weapons locker where loyal guards kept their arms. Other crew members drifted into positions they had rehearsed, their movements so natural that even a suspicious observer might not notice the coordination. At 98, Elena raised the red signal flag, where it could be seen through the hold's single porthole. At 99, James's hand moved to the hidden knife tucked into his belt. At 100, the rebellion began. The first blow of the rebellion was struck not by sword or pistol, but by Harris's massive fist, connecting with the jaw of the Marine guarding the weapons locker. The man dropped like a stone, his keys clattering across the deck as other crew members rushed to secure arms before the alarm could be raised. Simultaneously, in the hold below, Elena led the charge toward the forward compartment where the remaining guards kept watch. The prisoners moved with desperate efficiency, their months of suffering channeled into focused rage. William Frost wielded a hidden cutlass with surprising skill, while Rebecca Turner and two other women overwhelmed a guard who had been abusing prisoners since Portsmouth. But Captain Morrison had indeed suspected treachery. As the rebels above deck broke open the weapons locker, a hidden group of loyalist Marines emerged from concealment, led by Bosun Drake with murder in his eyes. "Mutiny," Drake bellowed, his voice carrying across the ship. All loyal men at arms. The deck erupted into chaos as the two sides clashed with savage intensity. James found himself facing a young Marine who couldn't have been older than 17, both men armed with cutlasses and fighting for their lives above the endless expanse of dark ocean. Below deck, Elena heard Drake's alarm and knew their carefully planned coordination had been compromised. Still, they had come too far to retreat now. She pressed forward toward the ladder leading to the upper deck, determined to link up with the crew mutineers as planned. A gunshot echoed through the ship's interior, followed by screams and the clash of steel on steel. Elena reached the ladder just as one of Morrison's Marines came tumbling down, blood streaming from a head wound. Behind him appeared Harris, his face grim but triumphant. "We've taken the weapons locker," he reported quickly, but Morrison had an ambush ready. "We're fighting for every inch up here." Elena nodded and began climbing toward the deck, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. The night air hit her face like a blessing after months in the suffocating hold. But the scene that greeted her was pure pandemonium. Bodies lay scattered across the deck, some moving, others ominously still. James fought desperately near the mainmast, his back still bearing the marks of his recent flogging, as he parried strikes from two opponents. Blood soaked the wooden planks, making footing treacherous in the dim light of the ship's lantern. Elena spotted Bosun Drake, advancing on a wounded prisoner, with a boarding axe raised above his head. Without thinking, she snatched up a fallen cutlass and threw herself between them. The impact of Drake's axe against her blade sent shockwaves up her arms, but she held firm. Well, Drake snarled, his scarred face twisted with malice. "The little governess wants to play at being a warrior." He swung again, this time aiming for her neck. Elena dodged desperately, her limited experience with weapons making her clumsy compared to Drake's practiced brutality. The axe whistled past her ear, and she knew she couldn't survive many more such exchanges. James saw Elena's peril from across the deck and fought with renewed fury to reach her. He dispatched one opponent with a thrust to the chest, and spun to face the second, but the distance between them seemed impossibly vast as Drake pressed his attack. Elena stumbled backward, her foot slipping on the blood-slicked deck. Drake's eyes gleamed with anticipation as he raised his axe for the killing blow, but the strike never fell. James's cutlass took Drake between the shoulder blades, the blade emerging from his chest in a spray of crimson. The bosun's eyes widened in shock before he toppled forward, his axe clattering harmlessly across the deck. "Are you hurt?" James asked urgently, pulling Elena to her feet. "No," she gasped, though her hands shook as she gripped her weapon. "But this isn't over yet." The fighting continued to rage around them, but the tide had begun to turn in favor of the mutineers. Morrison's Marines, outnumbered and caught off guard by the prisoners' participation, fell back toward the stern of the ship where their captain had barricaded himself in his cabin. Whitmore moved through the carnage with professional efficiency, treating wounded from both sides with equal care. His commitment to preserving life in the midst of such violence provided a strange anchor of sanity in the chaos. As dawn broke over the blood-soaked deck, the last of the loyalist resistance crumbled. Morrison remained locked in his cabin with two loyal Marines, but the ship was effectively under rebel control. The captain's key, symbol of ultimate authority aboard any vessel, now hung from James's belt, though he had accepted it reluctantly. Elena stood at the ship's rail, looking out at the endless ocean that surrounded them. They had won their freedom, but at terrible cost. Nearly a dozen men lay dead, and twice as many bore wounds that might yet prove fatal. "What happens now?" she asked James, as he approached, his clothes torn and bloodied from the fighting. "Now we learn whether winning a rebellion is easier than governing after one," he replied, his voice heavy with the weight of new responsibility. "And whether we can find our way to Australia before our former masters find us." The makeshift flag that flew from the Redemption's main mast bore little resemblance to any national colors. Sewn together from scraps of canvas and colored cloth, it represented something unprecedented in maritime history, a ship governed by democratic principles rather than authoritarian command. James stood before an assembly of crew members and former prisoners gathered on the main deck, the captain's key heavy in his hand. He had never wanted command, but the success of the mutiny had thrust leadership upon him whether he desired it or not. "We face a choice," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "We can attempt to recreate the same brutal hierarchy that oppressed us, or we can try something different, something better." Elena watched from her position near the ship's rail, noting how naturally James commanded attention despite his reluctance to lead. The past 24 hours had changed everyone aboard the ship, but perhaps none more than the navigator, who had never sought power, but now held the lives of nearly 200 souls in his hands. Harris stepped forward, his weathered face bearing fresh bandages from the previous night's fighting. "What exactly are you proposing, Cooper? We can't run a ship by committee." "No," James agreed, "but we can establish principles that protect everyone's rights while maintaining the discipline necessary for survival." He gestured toward Elena. "Miss Blackwood has been elected by the former prisoners to represent their interests in our new governance. Together we'll establish rules that serve justice rather than arbitrary power." The process of creating their new society took 3 days of intense debate. Every decision, from the distribution of food rations to the assignment of work duties, required negotiation between groups that had previously been kept separate by force. Whitmore emerged as an unexpected moral authority, his medical training giving him unique perspective on matters of life and death. "I've seen what happens when power corrupts completely," he told the assembly during one heated discussion. Captain Morrison lost his humanity by degrees, making each cruel decision easier than the last. "We must build safeguards against such corruption." The most difficult challenge came when they discovered the true extent of Morrison's crimes. Hidden in the captain's cabin, Elena found detailed records showing how he had been skimming rations, selling medical supplies at ports, and falsifying death reports to cover his systematic murder of prisoners. 17 people died who might have lived. Elena reported to the council they had established. Morrison wasn't just cruel, he was stealing food from dying people to increase his personal profit. The revelation sparked demands for immediate justice. Several former prisoners called for Morrison to be hanged from the same rigging where he had ordered so many floggings. Others argued for a more civilized approach, suggesting they deliver him to authorities in Australia for proper trial. James found himself mediating between those who demanded blood vengeance and those who insisted on legal justice. The decision they reached reflected their commitment to being better than their oppressors. "Morrison will be confined under guard until we reach Australia," James announced. "There, he'll face trial for his crimes under proper legal authority. We won't become murderers, even for the sake of justice." The decision wasn't popular with everyone, but it established a crucial precedent. Their new society would be governed by law rather than emotion, no matter how justified their anger might be. More immediate challenges demanded attention. The ship was dangerously off course. Their food supplies were lower than expected, and several serious repairs needed completion before they encountered another storm. James's navigation skills proved invaluable, but even his expertise couldn't solve all their problems. "We're at least 2 weeks behind schedule," he reported to Elena during a private moment in what had been Morrison's cabin. The mutiny cost us time we couldn't afford to lose. Elena studied the charts spread across the table, their route marked in red ink that seemed ominous in the lamplight. Can we make up the time? Possibly if the weather cooperates and we don't encounter any more crises. But we're sailing into the storm season, and this old ship wasn't built for speed even when she was new. Their relationship had evolved along with their circumstances. No longer navigator and prisoner, they now worked as partners in the enormous task of keeping their makeshift community alive and functional. The attraction between them had deepened into something approaching love, though neither had spoken the words aloud. "There's something else," James said quietly. "I've been thinking about what happens when we reach Australia. Technically, we're all criminals now. Mutiny is treason, regardless of how justified our actions might have been." Elena met his eyes across the table. "Then we'll face that challenge when it comes, just as we've faced all the others." Outside their window, the ocean stretched endlessly toward an uncertain horizon. They had won their freedom and established their principles, but the hardest tests of their resolve still lay ahead. In the distance, storm clouds gathered like a reminder that nature cared nothing for human ideals or democratic principles. The flag they had created snapped in the rising wind, its bright colors defiant against the darkening sky. The damaged sextant lay in pieces across James's makeshift desk, its brass fittings corroded and its mirrors cracked beyond repair. The instrument had been broken during the mutiny's violence, and without it, precise navigation became nearly impossible. James stared at the fragments, knowing that their survival might depend on his ability to find Australia using only dead reckoning and celestial observation with inferior tools. "How bad is it?" Elena asked, settling beside him in the cramped chart room they had established in the former captain's quarters. "Bad enough," James replied, attempting to salvage usable pieces from the wreckage. "I can estimate our position within 50 miles or so, but that margin of error could mean the difference between finding port and sailing past Australia entirely." The food situation had grown more critical with each passing day. Elena's careful rationing had extended their supplies longer than expected, but mathematics was inexorable. They had perhaps 2 weeks of provisions remaining, and James estimated at least 3 weeks to reach Sydney Harbour under current conditions. "We need to reduce rations again," Elena said quietly, voicing what they both knew. "Another 10% across all categories." James nodded grimly. 10% might not sound significant, but when applied to already meager rations, it meant the difference between slow starvation and rapid death. Around them, people were already showing signs of malnutrition: hollow cheeks, listless movements, the dull eyes of those whose bodies were beginning to consume themselves. The situation was complicated by philosophical divisions that threatened their democratic experiment. Some former prisoners argued for continuing toward Australia, where they might build new lives in a land that offered opportunity despite the risks. Others, led by William Frost, insisted they should attempt to return to England and seek justice through legal channels. "We have evidence of Morrison's crimes," Frost argued during a heated council meeting. "Surely any reasonable court would see that we acted in self-defense against a tyrant who was murdering us systematically." Harris shook his head emphatically. "Courts don't care about dead prisoners. They care about maintaining order and hierarchy. We'd hang within a week of reaching English soil." Elena found herself caught between the two factions, her education making her sympathetic to Frost's faith in legal justice, while her experience aboard the ship had taught her the harsh realities of power and privilege. "The question isn't what's morally right," she said finally. "It's what gives us the best chance of survival and freedom. In England, we're criminals. In Australia, we might be pioneers." The debate continued for hours, but James's navigation skills made the practical decision for them. "Based on our current position and remaining supplies," he announced, "attempting to reach England would require at least 2 months at sea. We don't have the food or water to survive that journey." Dr. Whitmore supported the decision from a medical perspective. "Half our people are already showing signs of scurvy and malnutrition. Extended time at sea under these conditions would be a death sentence for most of the weaker passengers. As if summoned by their discussion of medical concerns, a lookout's cry from the crow's nest interrupted their meeting. "Sail ho! 2 points off the starboard bow." The words sent a chill through everyone present. Another ship in these waters could mean rescue, but it could just as easily mean recapture and execution for mutineers. James grabbed his remaining telescope and hurried to the deck, followed by Elena and the other council members. The distant vessel was still too far away to identify clearly, but its size and configuration suggested a military ship rather than a merchant vessel. "Could be coincidence," Harris suggested hopefully. "These are regular shipping lanes, or it could be a Royal Navy patrol sent specifically to hunt down escaped prisoners," countered Frost, his face pale with fear. James adjusted the telescope's focus, trying to make out details that might determine their fate. "She's flying British colours," he reported, "and she's definitely a warship. Frigate class, probably 36 guns. Elena felt her heart sink. Their converted merchant vessel, damaged by months of abuse and the recent mutiny, could never outrun or outfight a purpose-built warship. If the approaching ship intended to recapture them, resistance would be futile. "What are our options?" she asked James quietly. "Limited," he replied grimly. "We can try to run, but she'll catch us within hours. We can try to fight, but that's suicide. Or we can attempt to deceive them somehow." The approaching ship had clearly spotted them as well, altering course to intercept rather than merely passing by. Within minutes, the decision of how to respond would be taken from them entirely. "Signal flags," James said suddenly, his voice taking on new urgency. "Elena, can you sew? We need to create signals that identify us as something other than what we are." Elena was already moving toward the ship's limited supply of colored cloth. "What kind of signals?" "Medical emergency," James decided. "Plague ship requesting assistance but maintaining quarantine distance. It might keep them from coming too close." As Elena worked frantically to create the deceptive signals, the warship continued its approach, growing larger and more menacing with each passing minute. Their freedom, won at such terrible cost, might be about to end before they ever reached their promised land. The Royal Navy flag snapped proudly in the wind as HMS Intrepid closed the distance between the ships with predatory efficiency. Captain Sir Edmund Blackthorne stood at his vessel's bow, telescope trained on the converted merchant ship that flew the yellow quarantine pennant, but somehow seemed suspicious despite its apparent medical distress. "Signal from the merchant vessel, sir," reported his flag lieutenant. "Claims to be the merchant ship Providence bound for Calcutta, requesting medical assistance, but maintaining quarantine due to fever aboard." Blackthorne lowered his telescope, his weathered face creased with suspicion. 23 years of naval service had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about the distant ship felt wrong. Her rigging was makeshift, her course erratic, and most tellingly, she flew no company pennant alongside her quarantine flag. "Close to hailing distance, but maintain safe separation," he ordered. "If they truly have plague aboard, we don't want to risk infection, but I want to examine them more closely." Aboard the Redemption, James watched the approaching warship with growing desperation. His deception had bought them time, but a closer inspection would reveal inconsistencies that no amount of clever signaling could explain. "Can we outrun them?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer from James's expression. "Not in this old tub," he replied grimly. "She's built for cargo, not speed. That frigate could overhaul us in an hour if she chose to pursue." The next few minutes would determine whether their desperate gamble succeeded or failed. James had positioned their weakest-looking passengers on deck, instructing them to appear as sickly as possible. Dr. Whitmore stood ready with a collection of authentic-looking medical equipment, prepared to play the role of ship's surgeon, dealing with a plague outbreak. "Ahoy, the Providence," came the hail from the naval vessel as it drew within shouting distance. "This is His Majesty's ship Intrepid. State your condition and destination." James took up the speaking trumpet, praying his voice would carry the right note of authority and desperation. "Intrepid, we are bound for Calcutta, but have fever aboard. Request medical consultation but advise maintaining distance for your safety. Through his telescope, Captain Blackthorne studied the figures visible on the merchant ship's deck. Several appeared genuinely ill, and a man in medical attire moved among them with professional efficiency. Yet something about the ship's configuration continued to trouble him. "Mr. Hartwell," he called to his first officer, "what do you make of that vessel's conversion? Looks like she's been fitted with additional compartments below deck." Lieutenant Hartwell raised his own telescope. "Could be slave ship modifications, sir. Or perhaps prisoner transport. Hard to say at this distance." The word sent a chill through Blackthorne. His orders had included warnings about a missing prison transport that had failed to reach its scheduled destination. The timing and location was suspiciously coincidental. "Signal them to heave to for medical inspection," Blackthorne commanded. "If they truly need help, they won't object to closer examination." The order reached James like a death sentence. Compliance meant discovery and execution for everyone aboard. Refusal would trigger immediate pursuit and bombardment by a ship that outgunned them completely. "They're demanding to come alongside," Elena observed, watching the flag signals being run up, Intrepid's rigging. James made the only decision that offered any hope of survival. "All hands prepare for emergency sail," he shouted. "We're running for the reef line." The plan was desperate to the point of madness. Ahead lay a chain of coral reefs, marked on his charts as extremely dangerous to navigation. Ships regularly foundered in those waters, torn apart by hidden coral formations that could gut a hull like a knife. But the Redemption drew less water than the heavily armed frigate, and James's intimate knowledge of these charts might give them an advantage. "Are you insane?" Harris demanded, as crew members scrambled to set additional canvas. "Those reefs will tear us apart." "Maybe," James replied, taking the wheel himself, "but Blackthorne won't risk his ship following us into known hazards. We thread the needle or we die trying." Behind them, HMS Intrepid responded to their sudden flight with professional efficiency. Gun ports opened along her sides as she came about in pursuit, her superior speed quickly closing the gap between the vessels. "Warning shot across our bow," Elena reported as a cannonball splashed into the water ahead of them. James held his course, studying the water ahead for the telltale signs of shallow coral that could either save them or destroy them. The reef line was marked on his charts, but charts could be wrong, especially in these remote waters where surveys were incomplete. "Next shot won't be a warning," Harris observed grimly as Intrepid's guns adjusted their aim. "Then we'd better make the reefs before they get the range," James replied, spinning the wheel hard to starboard as he spotted the first coral heads beneath the azure surface. The sound of grinding coral against the ship's hull echoed through the vessel like the groans of a dying giant. The broken mast crashed into the sea with a sound like thunder, taking with it their mainsail and half their rigging. The Redemption lurched violently to port as the weight of the fallen timber dragged at her hull, threatening to capsize the already struggling vessel. "Cut it away," James shouted over the chaos, fighting to maintain control as the ship wallowed helplessly among the coral heads. "Use axes, knives, anything. We have to free ourselves before she goes under." Elena grabbed a hatchet from the tool locker and joined the desperate crew members, hacking at the tangled rigging that connected the fallen mast to the ship. Each wave that crashed over the deck drove them closer to the razor-sharp coral formations that had already torn gaping wounds in their hull. Behind them, HMS Intrepid had come to a complete stop at the edge of the reef line, her captain unwilling to risk his ship in waters that had already claimed their quarry. Through the spray and chaos, Elena could see the warship's crew watching their struggle with professional interest, content to let the reefs finish what their cannons had started. "She's taking on water fast," Whitmore reported as he emerged from below deck, his medical bag replaced by a bucket for bailing. The coral punched holes through her hull in at least 3 places. "We're lucky she hasn't broken apart completely." James felt despair wash over him as thoroughly as the ocean waves soaking the deck. They had escaped immediate capture only to face slower death by drowning. The ship was dying beneath their feet, and even if they managed to free the broken mast, the damage might be too severe for survival. "There," Mary Henning pointed toward a gap in the reef line, barely visible through the churning water. Open water beyond the coral. James followed her gesture, his navigator's eye calculating distances and depth. The passage existed, but it was narrow and partially blocked by debris from previous wrecks. Threading that needle while their ship was damaged and barely controllable would require either extraordinary skill or impossible luck. Elena worked frantically beside him, her hands bleeding from the rough rope as she helped clear the tangled rigging. "Can we make it through?" she gasped between swings of her hatchet. "We have to," James replied grimly. "It's our only chance." The final cable parted just as another massive wave lifted the Redemption and drove her toward a coral pinnacle that would have gutted her completely. Free of the dragging mast, the ship responded sluggishly to James's steering, her damaged hull protesting every movement. "All hands to the pumps," Harris shouted as water continued pouring through the holes in their hull. "Keep her afloat long enough to reach clear water." The next 20 minutes tested every person aboard beyond their limit. While James navigated by instinct and prayer through the treacherous coral maze, everyone else worked desperately to keep the ship from sinking beneath them. Elena found herself beside Rebecca Turner and William Frost, all political differences forgotten as they formed a human chain passing buckets of seawater from the flooding hole. The ship scraped against coral formations with sickening regularity, each impact accompanied by the sound of wood splintering and the fear that this collision might be their last. James's hands bled from gripping the wheel as he fought to maintain their course through passages barely wider than the ship itself. "James," Elena's voice cut through the chaos as she pointed ahead, "the passage is blocked." A merchant vessel, wrecked months or years earlier, lay partially submerged across their only escape route. Its broken masts and scattered cargo created a barrier that seemed impassable for a ship their size. James studied the obstruction with growing desperation. They were committed now, too damaged to retreat, too close to the barrier to change course significantly. Their only hope lay in threading the gap between the wreck's stern and a coral formation that rose barely above the waterline. "Everyone to starboard," he commanded. "We need to heel her over to reduce our draft." The crew and passengers rushed to the ship's right side, their combined weight tilting the vessel at a dangerous angle. Elena felt the deck slope beneath her feet as they approached the narrow gap, spray from breaking waves soaking everyone aboard. The Redemption squeezed through the passage with inches to spare, her port rail scraping against the wreck's broken timbers, while her keel barely cleared the coral on the starboard side. For a terrifying moment, they seemed stuck fast, trapped between obstacles that could crush them. Then they were through, emerging into deep blue water beyond the reef line, like swimmers breaking the surface after nearly drowning. Behind them, HMS Intrepid remained trapped on the far side of the coral, her captain forced to watch their escape with professional frustration. But their triumph was short-lived. The Redemption was dying, her hull holed in multiple places, and taking on water faster than they could pump it out. Without immediate repairs, she would sink within hours, leaving them stranded in open ocean far from any possible rescue. "The pumps can't keep up," Dr. Whitmore reported grimly. "We're fighting a losing battle against the sea itself." Elena looked at James, seeing her own fear reflected in his eyes. They had escaped capture only to face death by drowning, alone in the vast Pacific, with no hope of salvation. The telescope trembled in Elena's hands as she focused on the distant smudge that had appeared on the horizon 3 hours earlier. What had begun as wishful thinking gradually resolved into unmistakable reality, a dark line of land stretching across their field of vision like salvation made manifest. "It's definitely coastline," she called down to James, who stood knee-deep in bilge water directing the desperate repair efforts below deck. Rocky cliffs with what looks like a bay or inlet to the south. The Redemption limped toward shore with the determination of a wounded animal seeking shelter. For the past 2 days, every soul aboard had worked in shifts to keep the damaged ship afloat. Canvas and tar had been used to patch the worst holes, while continuous pumping barely managed to stay ahead of the incoming water. James emerged from the hold, his clothes soaked and his face grim with exhaustion. How far? He asked, accepting the telescope from Elena's hand. Perhaps 10 miles, she estimated. Can we make it? James studied the approaching coastline through the lens, his navigator's eye assessing wind patterns, currents, and the ship's deteriorating condition. If the pumps hold out, and we don't hit any more obstacles, he said finally, but it'll be close. Around them, their makeshift community had organized itself with remarkable efficiency despite the crisis. Dr. Whitmore tended to those injured during their escape through the reefs, while Mary Henning coordinated food and water distribution among passengers weak from exhaustion and malnutrition. Even former opponents, like William Frost, had set aside philosophical differences to work side by side with Harris and the other crew members. What do we know about this coast? Elena asked, studying the distant cliffs that would soon determine their fate. Not much, James admitted. My charts show scattered settlements along the eastern Australian coast, but this region is largely unmapped. Could be friendly colonists, hostile natives, or completely uninhabited wilderness. Elena found herself thinking about the strange turns that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a governess in England, her greatest concerns involving unruly children and household schedules. Now she stood on the deck of a stolen ship, leading a community of former prisoners toward an unknown shore, where they would either find sanctuary or face new dangers entirely. Whatever we find, she said quietly, it has to be better than what we left behind. The approach to shore revealed both promise and peril. The coastline was indeed rocky and forbidding, with powerful waves crashing against granite cliffs that rose like walls from the sea. But James's practiced eye identified what appeared to be a natural harbor protected by a curved peninsula. There, he pointed toward a break in the cliffs, where calmer water suggested deeper anchorage. If we can reach that inlet, we might be able to beach her safely. The final approach tested their nerve as much as their seamanship. The Redemption, barely responding to her helm, wallowed through increasingly shallow water while waves threatened to drive her onto the rocks. Elena found herself gripping the rail so tightly her knuckles went white, watching the granite cliffs slide past with terrifying proximity. Prepare for grounding, James shouted, as the ship's keel began scraping against the sandy bottom of the inlet. All hands brace for impact. The ship shuddered and groaned as she drove onto the beach, her forward momentum carrying her well up onto the sand before she finally came to rest. For a moment, silence fell over the vessel as everyone absorbed the reality of their survival. Then cheers erupted from passengers and crew alike, voices raised in celebration and relief. They had escaped Morrison's tyranny, survived the Royal Navy's pursuit, and somehow managed to reach land despite their ship's near destruction. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as the magnitude of their achievement struck her. James appeared at her side, his own emotions clearly visible despite his attempts to maintain composure. We made it, he said simply, as if he couldn't quite believe their survival. We made it, Elena agreed, then added with growing awareness of their situation. But what happens now? Their immediate priorities were obvious. Evacuate the sinking ship, establish shelter, and assess their surroundings for threats or opportunities. But the larger questions loomed just as urgent. They were now criminals in exile, cut off from everything they had known, forced to build new lives in a land that might prove as hostile as the ship they had fled. Now we discover what kind of people we really are, James replied, watching as their community began the careful process of transferring their few possessions to shore. Whether we can build something better than what we destroyed. As the sun set over their makeshift landing site, Elena helped establish their first camp on Australian soil. Children who had survived unthinkable hardships played in the sand, while adults worked together to construct shelters and organize their meager supplies. Whitmore, surprisingly, had chosen to turn himself in to whatever authorities they might encounter. I want to return to England and face trial, he announced. Perhaps my testimony about Morrison's crimes can prevent others from suffering as we did. Elena respected his choice while recognizing that most of their community faced a different decision: how to build new lives in a land that offered freedom, but demanded everything else be created from nothing. The small seed felt impossibly fragile in Elena's palm as she knelt beside the freshly turned earth. It was a bean seed, saved from their ship's stores and carefully preserved through months of hardship. Now, 6 weeks after their landing, it represented something far more significant than mere sustenance. It was hope made tangible, a bet on the future in soil that might nurture new life. "Will it grow here?" asked young Timothy Morrison, the boy whose fever Elena had treated so many months ago aboard the ship. At 8 years old, he had adapted to their new circumstances with the remarkable resilience of childhood, though his eyes still held memories no child should carry. "We'll find out together," Elena replied, covering the seed with rich, dark earth that smelled of possibilities. Around them, the settlement they had named Havens Point was taking shape with surprising speed and organization. The community had split along natural lines during their first weeks ashore. Roughly half, led by William Frost, had chosen to seek out established colonial settlements, where they might eventually find passage back to England, or at least integration into existing society. The other half, including Elena and James, had decided to remain in their isolated cove and attempt to build something entirely new. The partings had been emotional, but necessary. Mary Henning, despite her age and past hardships, had chosen to join Frost's group. "I've had enough of pioneering," she explained to Elena during their farewell. "I want to spend my remaining years somewhere with proper tea and regular mail delivery." Harris and most of the former crew members had also departed, their maritime skills making them valuable in established ports. Only James and a handful of others had chosen to remain with the land-bound community that was slowly taking root along the sheltered coastline. Dr. Whitmore's departure had been the most solemn moment of their separation. True to his word, he had surrendered himself to the first colonial authorities they encountered, carrying with him detailed documentation of Morrison's crimes and testimony about the conditions that had led to their rebellion. "Perhaps some good can come from all this suffering," he had said during their final conversation. "If my testimony prevents other prison ships from operating under such conditions, then our ordeal will have served a purpose beyond our own survival." Elena had watched him walk away with mixed emotions, respect for his moral courage, but also fear that his testimony might lead authorities to hunt down the remaining members of their community. Now, as she tended her small garden plot, those concerns seemed distant compared to the immediate challenges of survival and community building. James had proven himself as capable a leader on land as he had been at sea, organizing construction projects and resource allocation with the same methodical precision he had brought to navigation. Their settlement consisted of a dozen wooden structures, built from timber salvaged from the Redemption and trees felled from the coastal forest. The largest building served as a communal meeting hall and dining area, while smaller cabins housed individual families and work groups. A workshop near the beach allowed them to continue repairing and maintaining tools, while a freshwater spring they had discovered inland provided the most precious resource of all. The work was backbreaking, but satisfying in ways Elena had never experienced during her previous life in England. Each shelter they built, each tool they repaired, each garden plot they cultivated represented tangible progress towards self-sufficiency and security. James approached her garden plot, carrying an armload of wooden planks, his shirt damp with perspiration from the afternoon's construction work. "How's our agriculture experiment progressing?" he asked, settling onto the ground beside her. "Time will tell," Elena replied, brushing dirt from her hands, "but the soil seems rich, and we have plenty of sunshine and fresh water. If the seeds are viable after all those months at sea, we should see sprouts within a week or two." James studied the neat rows of planted seeds with the same attention he had once devoted to navigation charts. "It's strange," he mused, "how much faith goes into planting a garden. You put seeds in the ground with no guarantee they'll grow, trusting that sun and rain and soil will work together to create something you need." Elena understood the metaphor he was drawing. Their entire community was essentially an act of faith. Former prisoners and sailors betting their lives on the possibility that they could create a just and sustainable society in an untamed land. Speaking of faith, James continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. I've been thinking about our future here, not just the community's future, but... He paused, seeming to search for the right words. Elena waited, sensing the importance of whatever he was trying to say. Elena, James said finally, meeting her eyes directly, I know our circumstances aren't conventional, and I know we don't have much offer each other besides uncertainty and hard work, but I've come to believe that some bonds are stronger than conventional security. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple ring, crafted from brass fittings salvaged from the ship. Would you consider binding your future to mine? Officially, I mean, in whatever way we can manage, without proper clergy or legal authority. Elena stared at the ring, feeling her heart race with emotions she struggled to name. James, she whispered, are you asking me to marry you? I'm asking you to build a life with me, he replied simply, whatever that life turns out to be. 5 years had transformed Havens Point from a desperate collection of survivors into a thriving coastal settlement. Elena stood on the bluff overlooking their harbor, watching her 7-year-old daughter Sarah and 4-year-old son Thomas chase gulls along the sandy beach where the Redemption's broken hull still rested, now serving as both monument and reminder of their remarkable journey. The wedding ring, crafted from ship's brass, had never left Elena's finger, though it now shared her hand with a proper gold band acquired through trade with visiting merchants. James approached from behind, his arms encircling her as they watched their children play in the surf that had once nearly claimed their lives. The supply ship brought news from Sydney, he said quietly, his voice carrying both excitement and apprehension. Whitmore's testimony led to a parliamentary inquiry into prison ship conditions. Morrison was convicted and hanged for murder, and new regulations have been established for prisoner transport. Elena leaned back against his chest, absorbing the magnitude of what he was telling her. Their suffering had not been in vain. Other prisoners would be spared the horrors they had endured because one man had found the courage to speak truth to power. There's more, James continued. The inquiry also resulted in pardons for most of the Redemption's prisoners, recognizing that the mutiny was justified under the circumstances. We're no longer fugitives, Elena. We're free to return to England if we choose. The words should have brought joy, but Elena found herself conflicted by emotions she hadn't expected. England represented vindication, the restoration of her good name, and connection to the life she had lost. Yet Havens Point had become more than refuge. It had become home. What do you want to do? She asked, though she suspected she already knew his answer. I want to stay, James replied without hesitation. This place, this community we've built, it's become everything I never knew I was searching for. We have good land, honest neighbors, and the freedom to raise our children without the weight of old prejudices and rigid social hierarchies. Elena nodded, feeling the truth of his words resonate in her heart. Their settlement had grown to nearly 50 permanent residents, including several families who had chosen to join them after word spread of their successful community. They had established trade relationships with other coastal settlements, built a school where Elena taught reading and writing to children who would grow up free from the constraints that had defined their parents' lives. Besides, James added with gentle humor, where else could a former prisoner become the elected mayor of a thriving town, or a one-time governor serve as both teacher and magistrate? Their democratic experiment had evolved into something unique in the colonial world, a society governed by consensus rather than imperial decree, where former prisoners and free settlers worked together as equals. It wasn't perfect, but it represented something genuinely new in human social organization. Young Sarah came running up the path from the beach, her dark hair streaming behind her as she carried a piece of sea glass, worn smooth by years of ocean tumbling. Mama, look what I found. It's the same color as your eyes. Elena knelt to examine her daughter's treasure, seeing in the green glass fragment another small symbol of transformation. Like herself, it had been broken and tumbled by forces beyond its control, only to emerge as something beautiful and unique. It's lovely, sweetheart, Elena said, helping Sarah tuck the glass into her pocket. Now go help your brother build that sandcastle before the tide comes in." As their children returned to their play, Elena and James stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the Pacific horizon. Somewhere beyond that endless expanse lay England, with all its promises of vindication and restoration. But here, in this place they had claimed through suffering and built through hope, lay something even more precious, the chance to define themselves by their choices rather than their circumstances. "We'll write to my sister," Elena decided finally. "Tell her we're alive and well, and that she's welcome to visit if she ever wants to see what freedom looks like." James smiled, understanding that her decision represented not rejection of her past, but integration of all she had learned into the life they had chosen to build together. Years later, when their children were grown and Havens Point had become a recognized port on colonial shipping routes, Elena would often return to this spot where the Redemption's bones still marked their beginning. She would remember the woman who had stepped aboard a prison ship expecting to die, and marvel at the journey that had led instead to a life richer and more meaningful than any she could have imagined. The seeds she had planted in faith had grown into abundant gardens. The community they had founded in desperation had flourished into lasting prosperity, and the love that had begun in darkness had illuminated everything that followed. In choosing hope over despair, compassion over cruelty, and freedom over security, they had discovered that the greatest treasures were not those that could be stolen or lost, but those that could only be created through the courage to begin again.